Hello, everyone. I'm Mike McGinn. I'm the Executive Director of America Walks, and really excited about today's webinar. We got a couple of fabulous panelists to join us today. Before we get to their introductions, I'm joined today with a couple of American Walks board members. Paulina Baeza is, in addition to being a board member of America Walks, is also on the Metropolitan Planning Organization in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so is very familiar with the issues of regional planning for around transportation. We're also joined by Arliss Reynolds, who's gone through the America Walks Walking College. By the way, we're opening it up for applications soon, so if you're somebody who wants to go out and make a difference in your community, go check out our website and learn more about it. And she's also a city council member in Costa Mesa. Next slide. Big thank you. These webinars are funded by Active People Healthy Nation, which is a program of the Centers for Disease Control. They fund these educational programs, our walking college, and other work we do with advocates. And what's fabulous about them is they are focused on how do we change places so people can integrate activity into their daily lives. We're also really grateful to our corporate sponsors, and we are also really grateful to the individual donors who support what we do. And if you'd like to be one of those, you will have ample opportunities to donate today or later. Let's introduce, well, first, a little bit of bookkeeping. You can enter questions in the Q&A. It's highlighted there on your section. The webinar will be recorded, uploaded to the YouTube channel. We'll send you a follow-up with any materials that are referenced by our guests. So on to our guests. We have our panelists today. Up first is Janette Sadik-Khan. She was the former New York City Transportation Director, very well known for the innovations she brought to that city. She's now the board chair of NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, who, from my own personal experience working in Seattle, these are the folks who are really trying to bring a people-centered approach to our streets as opposed to a more car-centered approach, and are a welcome counterweight to the history of transportation in this country, and a valuable partner, and we partner with them as often as we can in working on issues at the federal level. We're also joined by David Zipper, and if you've been reading the media and keeping up on things, he's all over. He's covering tons of great issues and things that we should be focusing in terms of vehicle safety, vehicle design, road safety, and really, I just think it's great that we have both of them. So welcome to our panelists, and we'll all get off the screen and turn it all over to Janette right now. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks, Mike. I am just trying to share my screen here, and we'll get started. And it is great to be here, Mike, with you and David. I consider David to be kind of the poet laureate of transportation, and it's wonderful. And for those of you that are joining us this afternoon, if you haven't subscribed to David Zipper, you must. It's how you start your day. And he always brings incredible insight and great humor, which is something that is not always found in plentiful buckets in transportation. So anyway, I'm just thrilled to be with Mike and David today. So I'm going to start with a question for all of you. And I just want you to think for a moment. What do you think about when you think about the future of transportation? What are some of the things that come to mind? Actually, if you Google it, Google actually has an answer. And it's driverless cars, and it's flying cars, and it's monorails, and it's hyperloops. And, it's kind of this visual jackpot of sleek vehicles that are kind of shooting through these clear skies. And the future of transportation isn't just a genre. Oh, can you guys see? Apparently, I'm getting some notes that you can't see the screen.
I am just getting a black screen, Janette. It says I'm viewing your screen, but it's just black. I did see, there we go. I now see the worksheet. You know what I mean? The slide with the slides on the side. You're in edit mode at the moment. And then when you go to showing it, it turns black. And I don't know why.
Okay, well then I guess you're just going to have to be imagining the future of transportation.
Or you could just show it from this screen and we'll have to live with it. I don't know why your slideshow isn't showing
Well,
properly.
we can see it, Janette. We can see it.
I can see your slides now, but it's got that left-hand column with
No,
all
no.
the slides on it. There we go. That's good. You could go from there if you like.
Okay, all right. Well, this is just going to be what it's going to be. So if we're nothing except adaptable here. So anyway, you can see, can you see that this is Google's?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so jackpot of sleek vehicles. I'm not even moving here. No, but I'm frozen. I'm frozen.
We are now seeing your hover vehicles and flying cars.
Okay, I guess you can you see me moving at all?
You're frozen, but
Yeah.
I try your next slide.
Okay, so I don't know.
We can hear you though, which is the most important thing.
Okay, and you can see the pictures. So
And the pictures.
okay, so cool. So you'll just have this nice little frozen thing going on.
Yes.
Well, I was talking about aesthetics. I didn't mean myself personally. But you know, if you look closely, essentially what we have is a more fanciful version of what we have today, right? You know, the flying car. It's basically just a car that flies, and you know, drone chopper taxi is basically like, you know, a helicopter with LEDs, and hyperloops are, you know, whatever hyperloops are, right? Kind of really fast subways above ground, and you know, it's always so space agey, right? And you've got, you know, it's completely uncomplicated without, you know, any streets or any people, you know, or maybe you get a guy walking a robot dog, you know, like you do. I mean, it's amazing, you know, it's supposed to be the future. Even the Jetsons had a real dog, you know, and this one is on a leash. You know, and when you think about it, if you can't even let a robot dog off the leash, it's really hard to see how we're going to get driverless cars. So there's an aesthetic, but there's also a culture built around the future and all of the benefits that it's supposed to bring. And that fantasy is watching TV in an automatic car with this Xanax and chill vibe to it, you know, and you've probably seen this movie before, right? We've got this long history of imagining the future. This was a sort of Valium version back in the 1950s. You know, back then people expected that we would be sipping lattes in automatic cars or zipping through inner city tubes that look a lot like hyperloops. And, you know, this is the LED version, you know, that you can see here today. And, you know, when you think about it, and David's certainly seen this, you know, we've had 10 years of headlines announcing the dawn of the autonomous age, and lots of predictions that driverless cars are going to be safer. You know, it's going to reduce our need to drive and the need for parking and the need for car ownership. We have heard so much about the future of transportation. But you still can't cross the street safely in Orlando. And while we've been dreaming about the future of driverless cars, there are ever more cars on America's roads that are driving more miles. There are more people dying on American roads, and pedestrian deaths are at all-time highs. Meanwhile, fewer people are riding transit, and places like Washington, New York, and Boston are paying the price of disinvestment. And talking about transportation over the last few years can start to feel a lot like Eeyore, you know, and there are plenty of reasons to be fearful looking at the transportation status quo, you know, and to paraphrase Eeyore, it's not much of a transportation network, but I'm attached to it. But I'd like to pivot from reasons to be fearful to reasons to be cheerful, like poo, and give you a dozen reasons to be cheerful in 2023. Because the good news is we don't need driverless cars to make streets safer. And we don't need AI to make downtowns more walkable, to plant more trees, or to create more open space. And if you look beyond the headlines, you can see a realignment and rethinking of streets, unlike anything since the dawn of the automotive age. So I'm going to give you these dozen reasons. Our 12th reason to be cheerful was in the New York Times earlier this month. And as most of you have known for most of your professional lives, more roads breeds more traffic and more congestion. And this is over 50 years after Louis Mumford identified it. But we're seeing more city and state DOTs taking new approaches against highway construction and reconstruction and expansion, whether it's the 710 in LA or the Katy Freeway in Houston. We're seeing people move in a new direction at the state and federal level. Next, many cities used the pandemic as a transition point. They were consciously choosing not to return to the status quo. Whether it was San Francisco that was creating car-free drives through Golden Gate Park, giving people a really low stress corridor that ran from the ocean through the city, to the open streets in New York City, the car-free streets in Seattle, the pandemic bike lanes in Austin, the pop-up bus lanes in Chicago. It's a global development from Paris to Milan, from Barcelona to Bogota. Reason to be cheerful number 10, because there's more evidence than ever that streets built for people to bike, to walk, to sit and eat are better for business. In New York City alone, we saw a 10% increase in retail sales versus nearby corridors. And we saw similar results in London. A 2022 study of low traffic neighborhoods found that cycling almost tripled and car traffic dropped by 76% and neighborhoods were safer. All reasons to be cheerful. Reason number 9. It doesn't quite sing like the soundtrack to Hair, but in the decade, we've been obsessing over Elon Musk's tweets and his 10th anniversary proclamation that driverless cars are coming this year. Americans took 500 million trips on micromobility. And leading that charge is the rise of electric scooters and bikes, which are really changing the mobility game. And all of that is happening without city subsidies, and in most cases, without federal and state credits for purchases, despite the fact that our roads aren't built for them. I mean, I really think that the future of transportation is on an e-bike. Reason to be cheerful number 8, because this year we'll have a new guide, hopefully not the same as the old guide, and certainly not after 25,000 public comments. Building a street, according to the MUTCD, is like consulting an ancient oracle about home plumbing decisions. You get an answer that only an engineer can understand, and it always, always involves building everything bigger and building them wider, and your living room is still flooded. And it prevents progress on the kind of walkable, bikeable, busable streets that we all want to move safely around our cities. 2023 will be the year of the MUTCD. NACDO's staff and 90 member cities, and many of you on the call today, have combed every page of the guide to make great streets legal. And revising standards that have kept speed limits high, making it safe to cross the street, and to take seriously the safety of people not in cars. Reason to be cheerful number 7. The new urban bike design guide is coming. It's a comprehensive update to our landmark guide, and it takes it from its original permission slip for cities to building protected bike lanes to a prescription slip for cities on how to build safe cycling networks for people of all ages and abilities. Reasons to be cheerful number 6, because language in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act allows cities to apply NACDO street design guidance to federally funded projects on city streets, even if a state requires different standards. And this is really crucial for everyone to know and for advocates to know to push cities to adopt and use NACDO guides. Reason to be cheerful number 5. There are real federal dollars on the table for cities, up to $15 billion in raised funds over 5 years, and the deadline is next month, and another $5 billion in Safe Streets for All funding. And if you need help on grant applications or if you have any kind of questions about the program, NACDO is supporting a boot camp through the local infrastructure hub, which you can check out on nacdo.org. Reason to be cheerful number 4 is that there is specific money that is dedicated to removing outdated infrastructure and reconnecting people in neighborhoods that have been divided by highways for decades. And there's more to come in the neighborhood access and equity program, some $3 billion that's going to be available through the Inflation Reduction Act. Reason to be cheerful number 3, we're looking a lot to Washington, but all transportation is local, and we are seeing great progress on city streets with so many cities lowering speed limits. There's a steady drumbeat from Hoboken and Salt Lake City to Austin, New York, DC, Atlanta, Minneapolis, and many more. And a huge shout out to Mayor Bala of Hoboken. And thanks to his work lowering speed limits to 20 miles an hour and adding raised crosswalks and bike lanes and traffic calming, Hoboken has had 6 years of 0 deaths. That's extraordinary. Reason to be cheerful number 2, because the Bloomberg Initiative on Cycling Infrastructure is coming to cities with grants to help them create the most innovative and transformative paths. The Bloomberg Global Designing Cities program will award 10 cities up to $1 million for transformative projects, and it comes with technical assistance from GDCI. We announced the program in October, and the deadline is in 2 weeks. And I urge all of you to check it out on bloombergcities.jhu/edu/BIC. And the most important reason to be cheerful is because the transportation community is strong, creative, and street smart at every level, as you can see here, with a new generation of leadership in DC and LA and Chicago, Philly, Pittsburgh, Houston, and the continuing groundbreaking work of Kareem Kisner at NACDO and Sky Duncan at GDCI, and so many more. And all of you on this call, we're going to be seeing results on the ground for years to come. And all of you are writing the story. It's becoming a real life ministry for the future, with a big hat tip to Kim Stanley Robinson. And I urge you to check out that book if you haven't read it. In a world where we act not just on the world where we live, but we act to create the world we want to see. Not by building bigger or dreaming of high-tech cars, but focusing on the spaces and places that bring people together and make cities cities. Because the transformative future of cities won't be the tech in our cars, but the life in our streets. And so for more on that, I'm going to turn this over to David Zipper, who hopefully will have more success in getting his presentation and face on the screen. David?
All right. Thank you, Janette. And now I will tempt the technology gods and try to share my own screen. Just one moment. Could someone give me a thumb up or say you can see it if you can see me and the screen?
Looks great. Looks great, David.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Janette, and thank you to America Walks. I've long been a fan of America Walks and all the important work that you do. And it's just an honor also to share the stage with Janette, who's played such a unique and central role with everything really around walkability and urban mobility over the last 15 years. And she also has always had a way with words, and today is clearly no exception. That phrase Xanax and chill is one that I'm going to remember, and I'm not sure I'm going to use it yet, but I will use it. But for now, what I'd like to do is to sort of delve into a particular topic that I'm interested in and excited about. And something that I'm going to be watching closely over 2023. And that is the rise of basically tiny vehicles, e-bikes, e-cargo bikes, golf carts, and mini cars. This is a trend that's been brewing. It's actually gone, it's more than brewing in other countries. And with e-bikes, it's also taking off here in the US. But particularly the mini cars and golf carts piece is one that I've been studying and watching, and I think it might be poised for tremendous growth this year. So it's something that I'd like to watch. And I hope you'll indulge me if I share with you some of the articles that I've written about this topic, because it's sort of a way of providing reference points for my own thoughts as they've evolved, as I've sort of come to understand this field and get excited about it. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in. But I think actually talk about tiny vehicles, we actually need to start with the big ones. So I'm going to start here with a photo that I took myself very close to my home in Washington, D.C., where I live. The truck on the right is an old Nissan truck that some workers, construction workers near me were using. And the truck on the left, the GMC thing, weighs over 6,000 pounds. And I'm quite sure that there was nothing construction related involved with its use at all. Instead, this is sort of an example of the rise of SUVs and trucks in the United States over the last really 30 years. They now comprise 4 out of 5 vehicles sold in the US, up from less than half just 20 years ago. And meanwhile, those vehicles have gotten larger and larger. Year by year, the models have expanded. You can see that visually here without really a utility, well under 60%, actually it's under 70% of trucks haul anything at all in a given year. Most of them are purchased for other reasons or preferences, which I consider to be a real question and frankly, a real concern. And in this kind of a crowd, I think a lot of you are going to know and be familiar with the safety issues that are created. When you have a tall, heavy vehicle, that's likely to create, it's going to create a lot of force upon impact. And for a pedestrian, you're going to be talking about hitting the person's torso, not their legs, which is far more deadly. And the blind zones can be terrible. There was a recent report by NBC Washington in my area that showed that an SUV had a 16-foot blind spot. That segment lined up 9 kids back to front, and the driver could see none of them. So we're talking about what I think is a pretty serious issue, and there's already research that has linked the rise of SUVs in the US to the surge in pedestrian deaths that Janette mentioned. We're now at a 40-year high in pedestrian deaths in 2021, and the SUVs and trucks are a big part of that. And I hate to break it, but things are going to get worse. At least I worry about that with the rise of electrification. This is an article I wrote in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago, basically calling out the dangers of electric SUVs and trucks. Of course, we don't have to have electric vehicles be this big, but that's the way automakers are going. And because of the batteries inside these vehicles, they weigh about 1/3 more. And basic physics teaches us that that heavier objects create more force upon impact. So I'm really concerned about this. And I'd like to tell you that our federal regulators are on top of it, and they're going to be addressing the risks of tall and heavy SUVs and trucks, but I just don't see that being the case. And as I explained here, this is really a function of what I think is 50 years of American safety advocacy and safety regulations, quote unquote, that basically focus solely on the safety of those inside the vehicle. We've basically, as Americans, been sort of taught that a safe car is one that's bigger than the other person's. And lo and behold, when you have this arms race of ever larger SUVs and trucks, that leads to serious vulnerability for pedestrians and cyclists, as well as those who are using our roadways in smaller vehicles. And I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit with this, but I think it's important to just sort of have this as a starting point. And, here's the thing that I'm not sure that we think about quite as much when we talk about the dangers of oversized vehicles, which I think the word is starting to get out about them now. Jennifer Hamady with the NTSB gave a big keynote at a big transportation conference about this just last week that was picked up in a lot of media venues. But here's something I'm not sure we talk about as much. The rise of SUVs and trucks has kind of been bad for car owners too. One obvious reason is that bigger cars are more expensive. This is why, to a large extent, Detroit has been shifting toward SUVs and trucks. We're hitting all-time highs in the price of automobiles, nearly $50,000 for an average car. A lot of that is because of SUVs and trucks. And when you add in the high interest rates that we face right now, that you're talking about really all-time records for how much people are paying on a monthly basis for their vehicle. And then at the same time, too, it's not easy to park these cars in cities, these SUVs and trucks. The vehicle here on the right is the Ford Maverick, which is Ford doesn't sell any sedans in the US at all anymore, but they do offer the Maverick as their urban vehicle. It's almost 17 feet long, and squeezing it into a parallel parking spot in Brooklyn is not going to be easy. So I'm going to switch from being negative to being positive, because I actually think that these problems, which in my view, car makers have created really for themselves by creating these enormous vehicles, they actually might end up inadvertently leading to a possible solution. And this is something that I spent some time researching and writing about last fall in Fast Company, leading to this sort of spicy headline: why car companies should fear the golf cart. It's not just the golf cart, it's also e-bikes and e-cargo bikes. In my view, the rise of SUVs and trucks actually widens the space where smaller vehicles can have a chance to enter the market and seize market share. And I can explain a little bit more about that here. I'm going to sort of summarize an argument from that article itself. And what I was drawing from in it is a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which is something of a classic as a business text. It's by a deceased Harvard Business School professor named Clay Christensen, who is revered to this day in Silicon Valley. And what Clay Christensen wrote about in The Innovator's Dilemma is this pattern in industry where in sector after sector, you have incumbents that are dominating the sector that keep building more sophisticated, higher performance, more expensive vehicles, because that's what their customers say they're looking for. The pattern goes on until something disruptive happens. And that's a term that Christensen popularized. The disruptive thing that happens is that a totally new product emerges from new companies that is much lower performance, a lot cheaper, but good enough that certain consumers can use it just fine for what they need. And actually, there may be some aspects of that product that make it more desirable to particular customers than the far more expensive thing that is already dominating the market. So applying that mentality to our current world of gigantic SUVs and trucks that are often quite expensive, this is how I think of it. It's no fun parking an SUV in a tight parking spot, and it's expensive. Is it possible to imagine that a family that has two big SUVs in an urban area might say, you know what, I actually think that we can do better. Let's swap out that second SUV and instead get an e-cargo bike. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier to park. Maybe this makes sense for us. I think that there's actually a big window for that to happen, and we're already seeing some evidence of it. And by the way, that e-cargo bike also creates negligible risk for others on the street, and it pollutes a lot less compared to the SUV, but that doesn't even need to factor into the calculus of the consumer. They might just say, this is the best thing for me. And it's not just cargo bikes and e-cargo bikes, with which I think a lot of us are familiar. I actually think golf carts could benefit from this situation as well. This is a photo that I took in the golf cart capital of America, some might say, which is the Villages in Florida. I was there a couple months ago, and you can see right here, 4 golf carts take up 1 parking spot, with the parking spot next to it occupied by a single vehicle. To me, golf carts could benefit from the same opportunities that e-bikes can, as the cars that we have in the US get more expensive and bigger. And I'm really bullish on golf carts. I think there's a tremendous opportunity here. I wrote about it in Slate. And the reason why I'm so bullish is that I think that they actually provide opportunities for mobility for those who don't have a driver's license or aren't able to, or are mobility limited, frankly. Not everyone can use an e-bike. I think it's quite exciting what they might be able to provide when we think outside of golf courses and retirement communities. And as an example, Peachtree City, Georgia is a fascinating case study. It's a suburb of about 45,000 people outside of Atlanta. Has 13,000 households, 10,000 golf carts that are using 100 miles of multi-use paths that are car-free in Peachtree City. And as you can see, the golf cart is so central to the town that it's on the official logo. And on the right, you can literally see what the school parking lot looks like. This is the high school parking lot. And it's kind of fascinating being there. People love it. This is the normal way to get around. And I talked to the mayor who said, it's so nice. People say hi as they pass each other in a golf cart. You're never going to do that in a car. It's another advantage. It's not just golf carts, though. As I wrote in CityLab last month, there is a tremendous opportunity to think about small vehicles, tiny cars of all kinds, especially if you look outside the US. And they can take all kinds of, they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Just a few examples here. Top left, K cars have been in Japan for 70 years. They're a third of the auto market. They're tiny. They cost about a third as much as a full-size car. Top right is a startup called Nimbus I've done some stuff with. They're providing a sort of leaning three-wheeled auto cycle, again, costing about $10,000. In the middle, the Microlino is a Swiss bubble car that has a obsessive fan base. Bottom left, the Gem, some of you might have seen before. It's what's called a neighborhood electric vehicle that is quite popular in certain southwestern areas. And then the bottom right is a new vehicle called the Squad that literally has solar panels attached to the roof, so you don't even need to charge it by plugging it in necessarily. All this stuff is already gathering steam in Europe and the US, and I think is going to be, it has a great potential in America as well. None of this is to take away from e-bikes and e-cargo bikes, which, as Janette mentioned, have really caught on big time in the US. They now outsell electric vehicles and plug-in vehicles combined. To me, I think of mini cars, golf carts, and e-bikes all in this category of miniature vehicles that could disrupt really the cars, especially the biggest cars that are so central to the United States right now. So what's the limitation? Talked about a lot of stuff here with e-cargo bikes, e-bikes, and the golf carts and the like. The limitation is places to use them. Safe places to ride. If this is the environment where people are considering for their golf cart or for their bike, they're just not going to do it. And unfortunately, a lot of the US does look like this. So it's a big issue. But there are solutions. This is from Peachtree City, where you have these beautiful car-free paths. I know not every suburb can do this, but check out how nice it would be to have a bridge that goes over the highway to keep people who are going 20 miles an hour safe from cars that weigh 5 times as much and are going, 50. Of course, you don't need to have those sorts of dedicated paths. You can also have just wider protected bike lanes. You make them wide enough, you could have some of these golf carts use them as well. You have to have a full network, though. And that's why I'm bullish on the BC Politanas of Italy. This is a map from Florence of what the BC Politana there. It's Italian for bike subway, where you can see it's a whole network of protected lanes that's being built there right now that, just like in Peachtree City, is intended to provide safe ways to get pretty much anywhere in the city for those who are not in an automobile. I think this is such a smart way to think about how to navigate a city with a small vehicle. Or, and again, this borrows from, or it rhymes with Janette's presentation, just slow down car traffic. This is the Villages. There's not a dedicated lane here for golf carts, but if cars are going 25, 20 miles an hour, golf carts and e-bikes are going to fit smoothly in with traffic. That's a whole other option, and it's a reason why this move toward lower speed limits in the US is an exciting one that I think can provide a tailwind to smaller vehicles. What we should not do, and this is one of my last points, What we don't want to do is subsidize only electric cars. I hate to admit it, but this is a message that I'm not sure the federal government has absorbed yet. Although I was excited 2 years ago about a proposal in Congress for e-bike subsidies last year in the Inflation Reduction Act. Unfortunately, that got stripped out in the Senate, and there never was anything really about golf carts and neighborhood electric vehicles within it. To me, that's a huge gap, and it's something that as a Democrat, I find frustrating, bordering on embarrassing, because we should be supporting these smaller vehicles that, among other advantages, are going to pollute a lot less than gigantic SUVs and trucks if they are electric. And I even mentioned this climate bill that was passed provides $7,500 for an electric SUV, but again, nothing for an e-bike or an electric golf cart. Fortunately, the good news to end on this point, cities have recognized that there's a space to step in where the federal government has not. Denver last year launched a wildly successful e-bike subsidy program that gave up to $1,700 for low-income residents toward a rebate for an e-bike or e-cargo bike. Hugely successful. 4,600 people have received the rebate so far. And according to the city, the average recipient is now replacing 3 to 4 car trips a week with their new e-bike or e-cargo bike. And I can tell this idea is spreading because Nashville and Washington, D.C. both suggested their own e-bike rebate just in the last week, which I think is pretty exciting. Final point, the lessons I might share with you. Number one, we have to create safe space for mini cars and e-bikes if we want to see them scale. And I certainly want to see them scale. I hope you do too. Number two, absolutely do not design electric vehicle subsidies at the state or federal level that bake in our autocentricity. We need to recognize the importance of mode shift away from cars. And then finally, get excited. There's so many wonderful form factors emerging with mini cars as well as with e-bikes and e-cargo bikes and now e-trikes. These things are fun, they're exciting, and they're fulfilling a whole bunch of different roles for all of us. So I hope that you'll follow this field with as much excitement as I feel. And if you're interested in sort of seeing some of the articles that I shared, they're all on my website, davidzipper.com. And if you want to challenge me or have questions, we can do so now. There's a lot of people on this webinar. You can always contact me via Twitter as well. Direct messages are open, as they say. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, David and Janette. Both of those were great. So Paulina and Arliss, join us on screen, and everybody unmute, please. Don't forget to unmute Janette and Arliss, etc. And Arliss, Paulina, why don't you kick us off? You had a question, and we have a ton of questions in the chat, folks. We'll do our best to get to them, but we'll start the conversation with Paulina.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you so much. And thank you, Janet and David, for joining us and sharing your thoughts and experience. It's very interesting. So I have 2 questions that did not come only from me, but from local people interested in these topics. We live and work in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is an auto-centric city like most in the country. And it seems like walkable places must build on existing walkable places. So my first question is, how do you coordinate the development of walkable development, as in, proper land use, density, and urban design, with transportation and street design so that they complement each other when they are typically siloed in departments and organizations that don't communicate? And a follow-up question, or secondly, is how can we encourage and implement more bike ped infrastructure when we face opposition from people, not enough support from political leaders, and there is a lack of understanding that we should prioritize equity?
Janette, that seems like, as a former department head, that one's right down your alley. And, what I hear in there is, how do you get agency world aligned? And then how do you get the public to, how do you work with the public?
Well, it's great. And thank you for the question, Paulina. I think, to start, people are always like, oh, well, we couldn't do that. I mean, you're New York and we're Tulsa, we're small, you're big, you're 8.5 million people and we're, 375,000 people. There is no street that's too big. There's no street that's too small, to make these kinds of interventions. It really is about imagining your streets differently. And, I always encourage people to try things, and I'll get to the agency question in a minute, but the idea is you can always move quickly to show what's possible and try pilots. And, I'm a big believer in paint. I sometimes feel like I should be subsidized by Benjamin Moore Paint Shop, because it's all about what you can do to show the possibilities that people really don't see, that are literally hidden in plain sight. And you can reduce the anxiety of city council members and more conservative mayors by saying, we're just going to test it out and see how it works. So I think that again, it doesn't matter the size of your city, it's really about the imagination. And I've seen huge imagination all around the country. And so again, it's not a matter of big city, small city, those streets are there to play with. So a big piece too is engaging local communities in these efforts, right? And so if you're in a place where it's difficult to get things done, again, starting to organize is really critical. We did so much work so fast under Mayor Mike Bloomberg. I mean, over 7 years, we completely transformed the city. 400 miles of bike lanes, 8 rapid transit lines, bike share, plazas, everything. But the bottom line is that we started, it was a 20-year battle that really had a lot to do with the advocacy groups. Places like America Walks that organize this today, organizations like Transportation Alternatives that made the case for 20 years, that made it possible, that tilled the soil, that made it possible for when I came in with Mike to really move fast. So I can't underscore enough the importance of community organizing to help make the case for these kinds of changes. That's critical. And then, of course, in order to bring these agencies together, you really have to have a vision of where you're trying to go. It's very difficult to turn the big ship of a city, even a small city, in a new direction if you don't have an idea of what you're trying to do. And so that big vision in New York City, it was accommodating 1 million more people that were going to move here, in 10 years. So what do? We have to look at our assets differently. And so that required all agencies to work together. We would never have been able to get the vision of Plan YC done, all of those agencies working together to get it done, if we hadn't had that bigger picture vision of what we are trying to do. And we found that success has many, many fathers, many of whom were, opponents or just different, they were indifferent before. And today, some of our biggest opponents are now biggest supporters. So a couple of points, and I'm sure David has some things to add.
I agree with everything Janette said. I will just offer one example that I really like. I think it's a very smart policy from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where officials recognized that, or actually advocates, frankly, recognized that that city council and the mayor kept saying, we really support bike lanes. We know it's so necessary for safety. And yet when push came to shove with a specific bike lane, you'd have these endless community meetings and suddenly things wouldn't be moving forward. So what Cambridge ended up doing was basically tying itself to the mast, if you know that phrase from our old Greek myths. But what they passed was an ordinance that requires the city, when they're doing repaving of a road or maintenance of a road that has a bike lane that's part of the master plan for the city has to implement the protected bike lane. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how. And that has really transformed the nature of the discussions with the community when the bike lanes are being implemented and sped up the pace. And I think this doesn't work in every community, but if you're in a place where suddenly local officials who say they support bike safety and say they support cycling suddenly end up getting cold feet when push comes to shove, I find a policy along the lines of what Cambridge has implemented to be a pretty interesting and potentially compelling direction to go in.
I would just add that the commissioner of that DOT in Cambridge was the head of our bus program at New York City DOT.
It all goes back to Janette, in case you don't know.
No, it's just like these good ideas spread. And like I was talking about, one of the main reasons to be cheerful these days in this country in transportation is there's so many good people at so many different levels and so many good people leading critical change organizations like America Walks, and you see what Mike is doing, what everybody's doing. I mean, it's like, Paulina, it's very exciting to see what's happening. Arla's here, city council person, changing the game. And it is about rolling up your sleeves and getting involved at every level.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, before I kick it to Arliss, I just want to say, I always think about it in terms of you have agency, elected officials, and the public. And you really need a weight definitely in 2 out of 3, best in 3 out of 3. So if you have a good law, but an executive and agencies that want to avoid it, they will, right? Like you really need to have the public pressure and people buying into it too. I also, as mayor, I thought I was an advocate before I was mayor, and I thought advocacy was important. And then I became mayor, and it's like I knew advocacy was important. Like you'd think I had more power than, and I probably did. But without the advocates out there fighting, and the other thing was getting a great traffic engineer in Dong Ho Cheng. So if there's any one thing you can do, get in on the hiring committee for your traffic engineer, and make sure they're a really good person if you're fighting in a city. And make your elected official put you on that committee or input because you helped elect them. Oh, I'm not supposed to lobby. Okay, Arliss, you got a question?
No, I love this discussion so far, and so much of it resonates with my experience also from advocate to council member. I'll just share, I've seen even in the last 4 years in Orange County, a very young car-centric city where really a lot of residents don't have the experience of a walkable city. That shift in what people want is happening, and the barriers are often the implementation piece. So I love the example of just sort of forcing yourself into the implementation and not making it a choice or discussion. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the sort of plethora of new mobility options that David brought up, and some of the suggestions you mentioned and suggestions I heard on the chat. It sounds like the data is clear on the disproportionate impacts of large vehicles versus small vehicles. But we, cities sort of treat them all the same, or in some cases don't allow the use of some of the small vehicles. Right now, we're wrestling with a lot of pushback against e-bikes because of the terrorizing effect of e-bikes on our streets, especially by teenagers. Not my opinion, I'm parroting what we hear from folks. So I'm curious what strategies you've heard or recommend regarding not just incentivizing what we want people using, but maybe taxing or disincentivizing some of the other pieces because of those disproportionate impacts.
You mean, sure, I can try to take that one. You mean taxing and handling the dangers of the oversized vehicles? Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah, just any strategies to sort of, recognize that larger vehicles take up more space for parking, for example, right? Create more wear and tear on our roads, are certainly more dangerous for our community members.
Sure. No, it's an important question. I think a really good question. I think the cleanest, most economically optimal, and perhaps just the best approach is to enact weight-based car fees. Most states and DMVs have fees that are pretty much across the board. You pay X amount per year to have your car registered in whatever state where you live. And there's some places like New York where maybe you pay a little bit more if you have a really heavy or big SUV than a small sedan, but it's like we're talking about tens of dollars difference. And that really doesn't capture the added externalities and societal costs of these largest vehicles, which pollute more, they take up more space, they create more road damage, and they definitely are more likely to hurt and kill people. So last year, Washington, D.C., where I live, became the first place in the country, in the U.S., to sort of attack this head on and redo its vehicle fees. So that now those who are registering a car that is 6,000 pounds or more, or an EV that's 7,000 pounds or more, have to pay $500 a year, which is 7 times what it would cost to register a sedan, a small sedan. And I wrote an article about this because I thought it was so interesting that ended up being, to my surprise, the most viral, popular story I've ever done. You can find it on CityLab or on the website I mentioned, which is davidzipper.com. But that, I think, is exactly the right approach. Car makers hate it. the Car Association of the US sent a letter to DC Council, this tiny city compared to the US, this is bad, you shouldn't do this. I think that's because they realized that this could catch on. And it's also caught on overseas. As of this month, Norway is the first country, to my knowledge, anywhere that has imposed weight-based fees on electric vehicles, as well as on gas-powered ones, which France has. Because Norway recognizes everything that we've been talking about. Also, there's another issue, which is that very large SUVs that are electric end up gobbling up lots of scarce minerals we need for batteries to be much more efficiently allocated toward e-bike batteries or e-sedan batteries or golf cart batteries. So I'm a huge fan of weight-based car fees. I have other thoughts, but I think that's the one I'll use my time to really hype up.
I would just add, I couldn't agree more with David, and we haven't caught up on pricing, which is a whole nother thing, and we haven't caught up in terms of how we price the curb, congestion pricing, mobility pricing. But I don't think that it's really, when we're talking about all these new vehicles, on our streets, I really don't think that it's a problem of mobility. I really think it's a problem of management. And our streets really haven't caught up with how people want to use the streets now. And so, you see all these e-bikes and scooters and now golf carts and, smaller vehicles. And I think the issue is allocating the space that we have. And we're still allocating the space the same way that we have for the last 75 years. And we wonder, why isn't it working? And again, it's just a question of management here.
Yeah, that's coming in the same way, just like the idea that 5 feet is the right width for a bike lane and only 5 feet, right, for protected bike lane. And, people like to ride side by side, a cargo bike's bigger, right? So like, how do we, and I really love David's point about if you can get your local speeds down to 20 miles an hour or less, maybe you don't need separate spaces at all. It's just using them, kind of, I think they used to call them streets, that's what everybody used, right? So we kicked the people off with the jaywalking laws, right? Like everybody could navigate those because the speeds were slow enough. Couple of questions here about how do we ensure access for all ages and abilities, and how do we ensure underserved communities? So, I'd love to hear perspectives on equity in the things we've been talking about as well. And we'll keep flipping it back and forth. So, Janette, your thoughts on how to ensure we get equity and issues about all ages and abilities in there.
Well, if a street doesn't work for everyone, then it doesn't work for anyone, in my view. I mean, I just think that's a deep, deep principle that we need to hold dear in how we, design our streets and design all of our infrastructure for that matter. That opens up opportunities for schools, for work, for everything. And there is some really good guidance out there right now. And I urge people to take a look at the Global Designing Cities Initiative Streets for Kids, which is about designing our streets, at the kid level. And again, that's how we make our streets work for everyone. And it's got comprehensive guidance. I encourage all of you to take a look at it, but just the short order, I could go on and on and on this topic, but Streets for Kids, gdci.org is a great way to take a look at some of the different interventions that are possible, the design principles, and guidance that's needed to ensure that we actually have streets that are equitable, that are safe, that are designed for all of us.
Yeah, and I will only add.
It's Global Street. Sorry, it's globalstreets.org. Sorry, global.
Yeah, you gotta get that in. You gotta get that in. And I think the only point I'll make is that I sometimes grimace when I hear somebody say, "Oh, bike lanes are just things that wealthy white people want." Because when you look at the data, and the U.S. Department of Transportation just put this out in the National Roadway Safety Strategy a year ago, if you want to find a source for it. But and I know Janette knows this, she's already nodding, but the per capita death rates for those cycling, you're much more likely to die cycling if you're Black or if you're Native American or if you're Latino than if you're white. And I think that, to me, the lesson there is we need to make sure that when we think about the imposition or construction of bike lanes and better sidewalk access in low-income communities, we got to make sure that we are reaching the people who are most vulnerable, because I don't know that they're always taking part in the community meetings that get held. That's something that I think is on all of us to keep in mind, what the data suggests, and to follow the data to make sure that we are investing in places where we can save the most lives.
I think another question and there was an issue raised in the chat. If you see my eyes looking over here, I'm reviewing the chat and pulling out some questions. One of the questions was, what do we collect data about, and who? And one of the observations was about data collection around commute trips and what that does to planning, as opposed to looking at other things, and who uses our roads when and for how. Is that something that you tackled in your work, Janette, of how do we assess who's using the roads and how they're using them?
I love that question, and that feels like a total,
Yes, it is.
softball.
I'm just throwing it right down the middle.
Thank
of the
you.
breadcrumb from Janette.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We're coming out of an era where data collection was all about counting cars. That's what it was. You measured a project by how many cars and how fast did those cars go. That was basically the metric of success. And so free flowing traffic going really, really fast, excellent project. And so what we need to be talking about is measuring people outside of the car, all of the users of the street. And when I was DOT commish, one of the things that we did was, just that. We would look at the effectiveness of a project by what happened to the safety of the street, what happened to transit movement on the street, what happened to people crossing the street, what happened to businesses, on either side of the street. Let's take a look at all of the factors that go in, curb to curb, not just the cars that are plowing through. And so today people are going, we all know that people shop more on a bike, people shop more on foot, that's better for business. People know that when you put down a bike lane, you make a street safer, not just for cyclists, but street safer for everyone, for cyclists, for pedestrians, for drivers. And so, how you count, what you count affects what you design, which is, I think, your point, Mike, right? And so I think we're starting to move to a different era. Federal DOT is starting to move away from level of service, when they're assessing roads. We've still got a long road to hoe on this, but we are starting to make some progress. And, we're starting to see now, and, as I mentioned in the earlier talk, that US DOT is allowing NACDO guidance on city streets, even federally funded, so that we are actually able to bring the kind of design guidance that prioritizes people first transportation, not car first transportation, which is the first time that we've seen that kind of, outside of the acceptance of the NACDO street design guide, really starting to move the ball down the field and opening up the universe to everybody, not just designing our transportation system for cars. So it's huge. So what's measured gets done. And I think we're starting to see a turn in that we're starting to measure the people and not just the cars.
Yeah, and I might offer maybe reason to be cheerful. Number 13, you had 12, right, Janette? So number 13 might be that, one of the silver lining of all the lockdowns with COVID and so many of us working from home part-time is that it sort of makes patently obvious that using journeys to work as a proxy for all transportation trips is patently absurd. I mean, people who are working from home are still taking trips. They're going to restaurants, they're going shopping, they're going to school, but they're not going to work. And some of us are going to work 2 days a week, some of us not at all. And for too long, we've basically equated all of transport. We've just collected data on commutes. And that has, I think, really skewed how we think about transportation writ large. It's also been gendered because women often do trip chaining more than men because of caregiving, because of doing various tasks. So my hope is that we blow up the conflation of trip data collection and commute data collection, because they're not the same thing. And we need to recognize that there's a lot of other types of trips people take and need to take.
So for our audience, Janette and David will hang in there for about another 10 minutes. So we got another 5 or 6 minutes of Q&A, and then I'll close. So hang in there if you like. And of course, there's a recording that'll be sent out at the end of this for everyone who has to, jump back into something else at the hour. Thank you for being with us the last hour. I think there's two other topics that I've seen a lot of in the chat here. One is thinking about, the difference between urban, suburban, and rural areas. And, what's a good way to think about those differences as an advocate? And we sometimes hear at America Walks, oh, you're talking about places that aren't our places. You're talking about cities. You're not talking about suburban or rural places. I'd love to hear perspectives on that. And of course, I think underlying that is the idea, well, what you're talking about is impossible in other places. So reaction. David, I'll throw it to you first.
I'm sorry, did you say to me? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, partly why that what you just said is part of why I'm excited about Peachtree City, Georgia, because that is an exurb. It is on the fringe of Atlanta. And yet when people get around within their town, they're not driving. They're using golf carts or they're biking. I didn't explain this in my presentation, but those multi-use paths are heavily used by those who are cycling and using e-bikes and the like. So I just don't believe that suburbia has no chance to be multimodal. I also would note that both rural areas and suburban areas, this is a point that Beth Osborne, who many of us are going to know at Transvision for America, notes, especially with rural areas, like small towns have some of the best urbanism. When you look at what's in that heart of the town, you have walkability, you've got wonderful architecture, you have apartments, you have density. You really can have actual nodes of multimodal living because of that density. So I just scratch my head and say, I just don't know that I buy it when people say that walkability and bikeability is irrelevant for rural and suburban America. And I guess the last point I'll make is just anecdotal. I was just chatting with the head of Rad Power Bikes, Seattle shout out for you, Mike. And he was telling me that a significant proportion of his e-bike sales go toward rural customers. And that surprised me. And I was asking him about it. He's like, yeah, they're using it in all kinds of different ways. But in particular, they're doing it in, like, again, when you're traveling around that sort of quote unquote urban hub of a small town, it's super useful, which is not something that I had expected. So I appreciate the question. I hear it a lot, but I would challenge it and say, actually, I think there's a lot about urbanism that is very relevant for suburbs and rural America.
Let me toss in.
I would.
Go ahead, Janette.
No, I totally agree with David. I guess I would just, start with where the people are, even like if you've got like a strip mall, can people cross the street? Is there a community nearby, where some people could walk? And to David's point, so many trips, 3-mile trips can be done on a bike, and particularly an e-bike. And so I think there's tons of opportunities there. I agree with him that, that it's not that the suburbs and rural areas are write-offs. There's so much potential there. And again, it's just about, don't underestimate what's possible.
So another thing that's a lot of in the audience chat is just, boy, that sounds like a lot of conflict, a big SUV and a golf cart and then a pedestrian. Right. So conflicts at all the different levels. Like, I don't want to share my bike path with a golf cart, things like that. I'll ask Janette, since she's board chair of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, give us some thoughts about safety and what really makes for a safe street and what could make, different. And David alluded to this already, but let's expand on that a little bit. Your thoughts on that? What really makes for a safer place in ways in which the different modes might be able to be near each other?
Well, I mean, I think that, and David mentioned this too in the 20-mile-an-hour piece in golf carts. I mean, the very first thing is speed. We need to design for the speed of life. And once we start with that design principle, all sorts of things open up. And I think the second piece is making clear that everybody on the street belongs there, right? The street is just not for cars. The street is for bikes. The streets are for pedestrians. And again, when you put down a bike lane, you make the street safer for everyone. You make the street more productive for everyone. You make the street more attractive for everyone. You create another way of getting around, which is healthier for everyone. And so, increasing the uses of the street, not just for moving people, but also for doing things, is also critical. And when there's more activity on the street, that changes the street. And so streets aren't just something to drive through. Streets are places to be.
That's awesome. Looking at the clock, I'm gonna go to Arliss and then Paulina. I'd love to just hear from both of you, from your perspectives, any reactions to what's been talked about, and then we'll close. Arliss, some thoughts.
Oh, well, you have successfully raised my optimism for this year. I think folks working in this space know that the day-to-day can be very challenging because there are many barriers, but hearing and seeing the successes and the opportunities and the reasons to be cheerful and the new technology that opens doors to lots of different types of mobility is very, very exciting. So I know there's a lot of resources America Walks will share on boot camps and funding opportunities. I am excited for 2023.
Paulina, reactions, thoughts, observations?
Of course, thank you so much, Mike. And I just want to echo on what Arliss just said. It's truly wonderful and inspiring to know that so many people are interested in working together, and how there's no small or big effort, like small projects, big projects, everything will make a difference. And having options for everybody is the goal. Trying to secure equity, trying to serve everybody is what we need to be thinking of. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts.
I'll echo the thank yous, and I do hope people are inspired. Kate, let's run the closing slides if I still got you here. Oh, here we go. If you like this webinar and our other free webinars, and by the way, talking about measurement, here's an observation. Measure the health impacts. So our last webinar was about how to measure the health impacts of transportation plans, which the cost of that far outweigh the alleged time savings from new highway projects, which is also false. So yeah, consider supporting us. We really need your help. Your individual donations matter. I also saw in the chat, this discussions about, boy, what can we do to help the advocates that are out there, kind of around the living room table, around the living kitchen table types of advocates. And I was one trying to get sidewalks in my neighborhood. This is one of the big questions we ask too. We have trainings, we have small community change grants, apply for them. There are other granting programs out there that we advertise, but really we're also looking for the funding world to start looking at this as such a great solution for health, equity, climate, economic vitality. In particular, the climate world appears to have, really latched on to EVs. But if you look at IPCC, which is all the scientists around the world, the new decarbonization strategy for transportation put out by the Biden administration, they call out land use, walkability, bikeability, transit-friendly places are an essential strategy for climate as well. So we're going to do our best to bring new people into that space as well. If you're an advocate and you want better training, check out our walking college, which is coming up in the future. We'll add you to our newsletter. And if you don't like getting stuff from us, there's an unsubscribe button. You can hit it anytime. But we really think that what's happening here, and what I really loved about Janette and David's presentation is, things are changing. They're not changing fast enough. They're not changing far enough. We want a lot more. But I've been doing this advocacy for some time, and there are, at some point, issues seem impossible until they aren't impossible. And at some point, public opinion moves. And the younger members of the public, the younger voters, the younger engineers, as well as, some of us old heads have gotten it already. So the public demand for this change is occurring faster and faster, and every individual can be part of that in their everyday conversations with people, because that ultimately is what's going to flip the dial on all of this stuff, is when we demand places that really work for us. So tune in for our next one. This is a tip on how to do a walk audit, which is a real easy entry point to advocacy in your neighborhood, a great start. And we're doing that in conjunction with one of our partners, AARP, who's a big advocate of livable communities. Okay, so I'm 1 minute over, David. Thank you again, David and Janette. That was absolutely fabulous. Love having you here, and thank you to our audience for joining us.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, pleasure.